Welcome back to the Bob Fu Report. Today I want to focus primarily on how the Chinese Communist Party tried to restrict, regulate, and persecute the religious groups that they are really in hostility. One of the groups we know since 1999 had been on the radar screen of the Communist Party's basic relentless persecution is called Falun Gong. I'm sure some of you have observed or even met with this Falun Gong group, which is a kind of a quasi-religious Qigong mixed with Buddhism, Daoism, kind of spiritual and physical exercise group. And it started, the campaign against this group started in 1999 when one of these branches of this Falun Gong group was deemed as a cult initially. That triggered a major backlash by this group with the Communist Party central compound in the city of Beijing, basically like the equivalent of the China's White House. Overnight were found surrounded by thousands of Falun Gong practitioners. They were very peaceful, but overnight, this all of a sudden, without any pre-warning or detection by any Chinese Communist Party security forces, including their kind of equivalent of CIA or anybody in the security apparatus. None of these security forces had a pre-knowledge, and overnight, the then leader of the Communist Party, Party Secretary Zhang found they were surrounded by tens of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners. So you can tell, imagine how scared this Communist Party leader is and was. So that's why after that one incident, the whole Communist Party and its government, security, propaganda apparatus started perhaps the largest mobilization against one particular religious group in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. We knew, of course, the Christian faith had been persecuted since the founding of the Communist Party-led People's Republic of China in 1949. But never before, after that crackdown in 1949, another religious group was targeted this way. So one of the mechanisms that was instrumental behind the whole crackdown against the Falun Gong group was called the Political and Legal Affairs Commission or Committee of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. This committee is a super committee as part of the Communist Party apparatus, overseeing all the political and legal affairs for China. They have the ultimate final authority to decide, policy level on any given cases on religion, politics, and national security, The national level called the Political Legal Affairs Commission of the CCP, and in every province, every city, they have such a committee under the Chinese Communist Party's direct ruling. And so in 1999, under the leadership of this committee, the established office called 610 office. Obviously, it was established on June the 10th, 1999. And under that office, basically, this brutal office with the leader of 610 office, they direct this most brutal, systematic persecution targeting Falun Gong and other so-called evil cult groups, including many Christian groups. And this 610 office has the overseeing responsibility for all the major decision making on religious freedom and national security, especially religious freedom cases. They have the authority that can decide whose homes can be destroyed, who can be arrested, who can be forced disappeared. Basically, the government even made an exception. Any cases that the 610 office decided there is no way to even appeal in the court. So the Falun Gong group in the past 20 years had been targeted under this mechanism in a very brutal way. According to very credible reports and documentation, and at least some 3,000 to 5,000 members were tortured to death. And according to the independent tribunal based in London on the organ harvesting, this group was credibly targeted for organ harvesting. So organ harvesting from a living person during their imprisonment is not only targeting for those leaders of the Falun Gong, but every ordinary believer, follower of Falun Gong had been targeted. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of them were sent to the so-called mind transformation camps. So that is really a prelude of the Uyghur and Kazakhs and even Christians who are now in Xinjiang in the concentration camps. So just think about this name called mind transformation camp, or they call it study or room or classroom for mind transformation. Basically, each one of these members of Falun Gong, if they are deemed as a follower of this spiritual group, they are subject to mind transformation. So every day they were forced to study the communism, socialism teachings and the Communist Party's so-called anti-cult laws. And also they have to denounce their spiritual leader, Mr. or they call the Master Li Hongzhi, and even with his picture, enlarged, put on the floor in their camp. So every Falun Gong practitioners during the mind transformation have to step on that photo and repeatedly and denounce their spiritual leader as an evil cult leader. And some have if you continue to insist your faith on the Falun Gong belief without confessing your crimes, without showing any signs of being transformed, being changed of your mind, then you are subject to the most notorious torture. A kind of torture is well documented by some of the even mainstream media, newspapers, certainly those some of the media in English, like the Epoch Times, the Newtown Dynasty TV, and the radio called Voice of Hope, and even some other reports by the New York Times, Washington Post, and AP, and many reports, and had authenticated this brutal campaign. And many women were raped. I mean, even like some husband, wife, I mean, were both practitioners, and in front of the husband, those torturers would rape their wife. I mean, the wives in their interrogation chamber. So many were abused to death. We have some even brave Christian human rights lawyers. Some of them were my close friends, like lawyer Zhang Tianyong, like lawyer Zhang, and lawyer Gao Zhisheng. And they all kind of from their conscience and their faith convicted them to go to speak up for those tortured Falun Gong practitioners. And they even went to the court, tried to file, just because as a legal professional, they made petition and file cases for those Falun Gong practitioners who suffer injustice. They themselves were arrested arbitrarily, and even subject for torture. I remembered one year when lawyer Zhang, or his English name is known as Kevin. So Kevin Zhang, he went to Chongqing City, one of the largest cities in China, to represent a Falun Gong practitioner, just to file the legal paperwork in the so-called People's Court in Chongqing. Kevin Zhang was arrested, and he described when after he was arrested, he was being hanged, like with a handcuff, being hanged in the air, and with his foot basically barely touch on the floor, and he was put in a cage, specially designed for this kind of torture. And he said he was being hanged, was so painful that he observed the torturer, the government interrogator. I mean, this is a lawyer, and he was he kind of saw that torturer calling his supervisor and basically asking for permission to lift lawyer Kevin Zhang a little higher, and how high to the to really on the ceiling of that interrogation chamber. I mean, a kind of a cage. And I still remembered Kevin, wrote about that later on. Said, he felt so helpless and even hopeless for the rule of law Like he was not going there to make trouble or even make public advocacy. He was there just as a lawyer to file a case. He was treated like that. And lawyer Gao Zhisheng, he was in trouble being, first lost his law firm, his license, and then himself was being tortured. His whole family had been subject for torture, as I mentioned to you many times in the past. And he was forced in disappearance for over 8 years. Before last time he was disappeared again. I mean, it's already more than 4 years. This lawyer Gao Zhisheng, we have a freegao.com campaign, purely because he first wrote a public letter to the then Chinese premier Wen Jiabao, ask him to have mercy on those torturous Falun Gong practitioners. So this is a real, the crime against humanity. If you want to have a simple technical term. And so according to the Epoch Times, in 2019, there was another secret regulation issued by the Political and Legal Affairs Committee with 3 parts. So the Epoch Times obtained the first 2 parts and the index for the third classified top secret portion. According to these documents, it talk about again how to upgrade the level of transforming Falun Gong practitioners and forcing them to denounce their faith with a higher technology. And each local precinct in the government is given a grade this time, depending on how many Falun Gong practitioners were forced to denounce their faith. So basically, that is an incentive or a bonus was offered for the local officials to use so-called creative way to transform the Falun Gong practitioners to denounce their faith and to change their faith. So that is one way the Communist Party is using as an incentive. Not only the Communist Party targeting the Falun Gong practitioners this way, we have found in the past few years the Communist Party under the slogan of Sinicization of religion and Christianity in many provinces across China. The same kind of incentive, monetary position promotion are being adopted to target Christians. In Shanxi Province, in the capital city of Taiyuan, police officials are found posting large slogans to encourage report of so-called illegal religious activities. And in Taiyuan, Pingyang Road, that police station, the officers, and the Pingyang community center officials posted jointly a large slogan on their window stating, "Report illegal religious activities and receive a cash reward up to 2,000 Chinese yuan, which is about 250 US dollars. So if you report any house church leaders or house worship, you can get a cash reward. So basically, this is the slogan meant to incite others to report Christians and their house church activities so that the officials can arrest them. And the persecution has really been escalating in the Shanxi Province for the year 2020 2020. According to our own investigation, the CCP has demolished missionary tombs from the 1900. That is known as the Boxer Rebellion time, where thousands of missionaries and Chinese Christians were martyred, were massacred and killed for simply following Christ. That was the year 1900. It started from that province of Shanxi, and the church called the Taiyuan Xincheng Reformed Church were also read it during the Sunday service recently, and there's another very prominent church led by Brother Zhang in his own home. He was detained, and the non-believers were arrested in a recent Sunday from the Taiwan, the Golden Lampstand Church. The Lampstand Church, Golden Lampstand Church, was persecuted since really 2009, and we all know that church, their church building was dynamized, basically bombed, destroyed. Pastor An from that Golden Lampstand Church, he said, I quote, "As God directs the show, how should we perform in it? Sometimes we do not know, but God told us to obey Him. In the past, I thought the martyr's blood shed more than 120 years ago sufficiently defined the land of Shanxi Province. I never thought that we would also be involved." That's end of the quote. So you can tell, this church, the kind of defying spirit from the love of Christ, from the Scripture, during this new wave of persecution is reflected with this quote. And in another situation, during the 5-year anniversary for Shenzhen Church, was disrupted by the local police. I know this church very well, and just last year, I think when they were trying to have a baptism ceremony on another city, not Shenzhen. Shenzhen is the closest city next to Hong Kong, but in order not to kind of make the local police alarmed, so they moved the baptism ceremony last year to beach city in Zhuhai, and but that purely a baptism ceremony was disrupted by the local police. They mobilized hundreds of police just try to stop a baptism ceremony. So this year is their 5th-year anniversary for that church. So that Shenzhen Trinity Harvest Gospel Church, they want to just have a short retreat for the members because, of course, this COVID pandemic, and but little did they know all their phones were monitored by the security officers all the way to their motel, and the church pastors and the deacons, elders, they were on a blacklist. As soon as they check in to a hotel, just to ask, and then within like 10 minutes or 15 minutes, the local police officers would show up and basically try to block them even to check into a hotel in that beach city. and the police threatened. This member of the church basically said, "You can't just gather. No matter what." So finally, by God's providence, they find a restaurant. The restaurant owner, while the church members were eating together, heard they need a place to stay. So the owner offered his own house for those church believers. I believe it's 30 plus members in that during that evening. So they were offered to stay, but the pastors were still kind of alert. In order to avoid the implication, disruption of other believers with the small children. So the pastor and the elders chose to go to somewhere else. But even that, the police showed up at midnight to force the believers to show their ID and try to force everybody out, who does not have ID, to stay in the private home, a villa of that restaurant owner. The restaurant owner himself was taken to the police station, being interrogated from midnight until 6 o'clock in the morning. And that's how it happened just recently. The police end up patrolling the beach until next morning. And later on, the church leaders found out, obviously, the security force had misinformation or kind of had thought the church would have a baptism ceremony again. It turns out it was just a retreat. So that is a recent campaign against this church. And we also learned Communist Party court recently sentenced Chinese activist Cheng Yuan for 5 years in prison. We know Cheng Yuan is an NGO leader, and since we rescued his wife, Faith Shi, Minglei Shi, and their daughter Aliyah this year to Texas, and after her husband was being imprisoned, and now we learned her husband was sentenced to 5 years as an NGO leader defending the vulnerable groups, along with the other two of his colleagues, co-workers Liu Dazhi and Wu Gejianxun. They were all arrested in August 2019. And so this is a secret Chinese state security operation, basically to crack down anyone who are doing social work. Yeah. So that is the report about what's happening recently. And of course, I would urge you to continue to pray for Sister Zhan, a Christian freelance reporter, a citizen journalist, a whistleblower for the beginning of the COVID-19. She had been engaging hunger strike since then, and hospitalized in July 2020 and forced fed by the CCP. So please pray for her, and may the Lord continue to bless her and sustain her. Thank you so much for your prayer. And if you want to know more details, please log on china.a.org. China.a.org. Thank you.